The morning mist clung to the Niagara River like a shroud of death, and Captain James Morrison knew that before the sun reached its zenith, blood would stain the Canadian soil. It was the 18th of June, 1812, and the drums of war had already begun their ominous beat across the border. The young militia captain stood on the ramparts of Fort George, his weathered hands gripping the cold stone as he watched the American forces gathering like storm clouds on the opposite shore. Morrison had been born in the shadow of these very walls, the son of a loyalist who had fled the American Revolution 30 years prior. The irony was not lost on him once again. His family would face American guns in defense of British soil. The War of 1812 had officially begun, though tensions had been simmering for years like a pot ready to boil over. British impressment of American sailors, trade restrictions, and territorial disputes had finally erupted into open conflict. The Canadian militia was a patchwork force: farmers, trappers, and merchants who had traded their plows and ledgers for muskets and bayonets. They were vastly outnumbered by the regular American army, but what they lacked in numbers, they possessed in intimate knowledge of their homelands, forests, rivers, and hidden paths. Morrison's own company consisted of 43 men, ranging from grizzled veterans of frontier skirmishes to boys barely old enough to shave. As reported by the York Gazette in its coverage of the war's opening, the American strategy was ambitious, a three-pronged invasion designed to capture key Canadian strongholds and force British capitulation. General William Hull commanded the Western Front, planning to strike at Fort Malden and control the vital Detroit River corridor. In the center, General Stephen Van Rensselaer would lead forces across the Niagara frontier, while the Northern Army under General Henry Dearborn would march toward Montreal. Lieutenant William Jarvis approached Morrison with urgent dispatches from Major General Isaac Brock, the British commander who had become the backbone of Canadian defense. Brock's message was characteristically direct: "The enemy prepares to cross. We must be ready to meet them with fire and steel." The general's reputation preceded him, a soldier's soldier who had earned respect through decisive action and personal courage. Morrison assembled his men in the fort's courtyard as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade ground. These were not professional soldiers, but ordinary men defending their homes and families. There was Thomas Mackenzie, a blacksmith whose powerful arms could swing a hammer or a sword with equal skill. Beside him stood young Samuel Hart, barely 18, whose father had been killed in a recent border skirmish. The boy's eyes burned with a mixture of fear and determination that Morrison recognized all too well. "Men," Morrison began, his voice carrying across the silent ranks, "the Americans believe they can march into our homes and claim our land as their own. They think us weak because we are few, unprepared because we are farmers and tradesmen rather than soldiers." He paused, meeting the eyes of each man in turn. "They will learn that Canadian soil is not so easily taken. We know every tree, every stream, every hidden trail in this country. We fight not for distant kings or political ideologies, but for our families, our neighbors, and our right to call this land home." The men nodded grimly, understanding that their world was about to change forever. Across the river, campfires flickered like fallen stars, marking the positions of an enemy force that outnumbered them 3-1. But Morrison had learned from his father's stories of the Revolution that numbers alone did not determine victory. Courage, cunning, and the desperate fury of men defending their homeland could overcome seemingly impossible odds. As darkness fell over the Niagara frontier, the Canadian militia prepared for a war that would test their resolve and forge their identity as a nation. The pre-dawn darkness of the 12th of July, 1812, was shattered by the thunder of American artillery as General Hull's army crossed the Detroit River into Canadian territory. Morrison and his men had been repositioned to Fort Malden, where they would face their first true test of battle. The fort's walls, built of limestone and timber, had seemed impregnable in peacetime, but now they felt pitifully thin against the American bombardment. Captain Morrison crouched behind the parapet, watching through his spyglass as Hull's forces established their beachhead. The American general had brought nearly 2,500 regular troops and Ohio militia across the narrow waterway, their blue uniforms stark against the green Canadian countryside. Hull's proclamation had preceded his invasion, a document promising liberation for Canadians from British tyranny. But Morrison knew his neighbors well enough to understand that they viewed the Americans as invaders, not liberators. The Canadian defense was a collaborative effort between British regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors led by the legendary Tecumseh. The Shawnee leader had allied with the British after years of American encroachment on native lands, and his warriors brought invaluable knowledge of wilderness warfare. Morrison watched in fascination as Tecumseh's men moved through the forest, like ghosts, their painted faces and traditional weapons a stark contrast to the European-style battle formations of both armies. Major General Brock had arrived from York with reinforcements, his presence immediately lifting the spirits of the defenders. The general was a tall, imposing figure who led from the front and shared the hardships of his men. Morrison had heard stories of Brock's previous campaigns. His innovative tactics and willingness to take calculated risks had earned him a reputation as one of Britain's most capable commanders. The siege began in earnest as Hull's forces established artillery positions overlooking the fort. American cannons, positioned on the heights across the river, began a methodical bombardment designed to breach the walls and demoralize the defenders. Morrison's men took cover in the reinforced casemates, emerging only to return fire with their own artillery. The continuous thunder of guns created a hellish symphony that echoed across the Detroit River Valley. Young Samuel Hart proved his mettle during the bombardment, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to carry ammunition to the gun crews. His courage was infectious, inspiring the older militia members to match his determination. Thomas Mackenzie, the blacksmith, put his metalworking skills to use, repairing damaged cannons and forging improvised weapons from scrap iron. As documented in the Detroit Gazette's wartime reporting, Hull's invasion initially appeared successful, with American forces advancing several miles into Canadian territory. However, the general's cautious nature and concerns about his extended supply lines began to undermine his position. Brock recognized this hesitation and prepared to exploit it through a combination of psychological warfare and strategic maneuvering. Indigenous warriors proved particularly effective at disrupting American supply lines and communications. Tecumseh's men conducted lightning raids against isolated American outposts, capturing supplies and prisoners while avoiding direct confrontation with superior numbers. These tactics created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear among Hull's forces, who found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders for enemies who struck without warning and vanished into the wilderness. Morrison participated in several of these raids, leading his militia company alongside Tecumseh's warriors. The experience taught him valuable lessons about unconventional warfare, the importance of mobility, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. His men learned to move silently through the forest, to read tracks and signs, and to strike at the enemy's weakest points rather than meeting them in open battle. The psychological impact of these tactics was profound. American soldiers, accustomed to European-style warfare with clear battle lines and established rules of engagement, found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to conform to their expectations. Reports of scalping and torture, whether accurate or exaggerated, spread through the American ranks like wildfire, undermining morale and discipline. Hull's position continued to deteriorate as British naval forces gained control of Lake Erie, cutting off his supply lines to Ohio. The general found himself in an increasingly precarious situation, deep in enemy territory with dwindling supplies, and facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Brock sensed the American commander's growing desperation and began planning a bold stroke that would turn the tide of the entire campaign. The morning of the 16th of August, 1812, dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the Detroit River like omens of the battle to come. Captain Morrison stood beside Major General Brock as they surveyed the American positions from across the narrow waterway. What they were about to attempt defied all conventional military wisdom, a direct assault on a fortified position defended by superior numbers. Yet Brock's keen tactical mind had identified a weakness in Hull's character that could be exploited through audacity and deception. Morrison's militia company had been assigned a crucial role in Brock's elaborate ruse. They would march repeatedly through a clearing visible to American sentries, changing uniforms and equipment to create the illusion of a much larger force. The psychological warfare that had begun with Tecumseh's raids would reach its culmination. In this masterpiece of military theater, the plan was breathtakingly simple in its complexity. Brock would demand Hull's surrender, threatening that he could not control his indigenous allies once battle commenced. Meanwhile, the Canadian militia and British regulars would position themselves to suggest an overwhelming force prepared to storm the American fortifications. The success of the entire operation depended on Hull's known anxiety about indigenous warfare and his concerns for the civilian population under his protection. Tecumseh's warriors played their part with theatrical brilliance, appearing and disappearing at the forest's edge, their war cries echoing across the water. The Shawnee leader had painted his face for battle, his presence alone worth 1,000 men in terms of psychological impact. American soldiers who had heard stories of frontier massacres found their courage wavering as they contemplated facing such an opponent. Morrison led his men through their deceptive maneuvers, marching them past the same clearing multiple times while changing their appearance. British redcoats became Canadian militia uniforms, then indigenous war paint, creating the impression of an inexhaustible reserve of fighters. The young captain marveled at the effectiveness of the deception through his spyglass. He could see American soldiers pointing and gesturing as they attempted to count the enemy forces. The decisive moment came when Brock's demand for surrender was delivered under a flag of truce. The British general's message was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, playing on Hull's fears while offering him a face-saving way to avoid a massacre. The American commander was told that once battle began, Brock would be unable to control his indigenous allies, implying that civilians and prisoners would suffer accordingly. As recorded in the Canadian Courant's coverage of the siege, Hull's response revealed a man overwhelmed by the responsibility for civilian lives and Paralyzed by uncertainty about enemy strength, the American general had been a competent officer during the Revolutionary War, but age and the burden of command had eroded his confidence. Faced with what appeared to be overwhelming odds and the threat of an uncontrolled massacre, Hull made the fateful decision to surrender. The moment of surrender was surreal in its anticlimax. Morrison watched in amazement as white flags appeared over Fort Detroit, signaling the end of American resistance. The garrison that had seemed so formidable from across the river emerged with arms grounded, their faces reflecting shame and bewilderment at their commander's decision. Many of the American soldiers appeared ready to fight, making Hull's surrender even more controversial. The capture of Detroit was a strategic masterstroke that transformed the entire war. Morrison's militia company found themselves guarding prisoners, who outnumbered them significantly, a situation that would have been impossible to maintain if the Americans had realized their numerical advantage. The psychological impact of Hull's surrender reverberated throughout the American military establishment, undermining confidence in their invasion strategy. Young Samuel Hart could barely contain his excitement as he helped inventory the captured supplies. The Americans had surrendered not only their garrison but also substantial quantities of weapons, ammunition, and provisions that would prove invaluable to the Canadian defense. Thomas Mackenzie, ever practical, immediately began evaluating the captured artillery pieces, several of which were superior to the guns defending Canadian positions. Tecumseh's warriors celebrated their victory with traditional ceremonies, their success validating their decision to ally with the British against American expansion. The Shawnee leader's reputation was further enhanced by the triumph, making him an even more formidable opponent in future campaigns. His tactical genius had been perfectly complemented by Brock's strategic vision, creating a partnership that would define the war's early stages. The miracle of Detroit demonstrated that superior numbers and equipment could be overcome through innovative tactics, psychological warfare, and the courage of men defending their homeland. Morrison and his militia had played a crucial role in this victory, proving that citizen soldiers could stand alongside professional troops when properly led and motivated. The success would inspire Canadian resistance throughout the war and establish the foundation for future victories. Against seemingly impossible odds, the crisp morning air of the 13th of October, 1812, carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of American preparations across the Niagara River. Captain Morrison positioned his militia company along the heights overlooking the village of Queenston, where the landscape dropped dramatically toward the churning waters below. The strategic importance of this position was undeniable. Whoever controlled the Queenston Heights commanded the entire Niagara frontier and the vital portage route around the falls. General Van Rensselaer had spent weeks preparing for this assault, and Morrison could see the massive American force gathering on the opposite shore. 13 boats loaded with troops pushed off from the American side under cover of darkness, their destination the narrow beach below the Canadian positions. The American plan was ambitious: establish a beachhead, storm the heights, and break the British hold on the Niagara Peninsula. Major General Brock had positioned his forces with characteristic precision, understanding that this battle would determine the fate of Upper Canada. The British regulars held the most critical positions, while Morrison's militia were tasked with defending the flanks and maintaining communications between scattered defensive positions. The general's presence was reassuring. His victory at Detroit had established him as a commander capable of achieving the impossible. The battle began before dawn. As American forces landed on the rocky shore below Queenston, Morrison could hear the sounds of fighting echoing off the cliff faces as British sentries engaged the advancing enemy. The Americans faced a daunting challenge, scaling the steep embankment, while under fire from defenders who held every advantage of position and terrain knowledge. Through his spyglass, Morrison watched American troops struggling up the precipitous slope, their blue uniforms stark against the gray limestone. Many fell to Canadian musket fire, their bodies tumbling back into the river, but others pressed on with desperate courage. The American commander leading the assault, Captain John Wool, displayed remarkable bravery as he searched for a path up the seemingly impossible cliff face. The tide of battle turned when Wool discovered a narrow fisherman's path that led around the British positions. Morrison watched in growing alarm as American soldiers began appearing on the heights, having bypassed the main defensive line through this unexpected route. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with Canadian forces in danger of being outflanked and surrounded. It was at this critical moment that Brock himself arrived on the battlefield, his presence immediately galvanizing the defenders. The general quickly assessed the situation and ordered an immediate counterattack to retake the heights before the Americans could consolidate their position. Morrison's militia would support the assault, their local knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable in the desperate fight that followed. The counterattack began with Brock personally leading his men up the slope, his tall figure unmistakable, even in the confusion of battle. Morrison felt a surge of pride and determination as he watched the general advance, sword in hand, toward the American positions. The British regulars followed their commander with disciplined precision, their bayonets gleaming in the morning sun. Tragedy struck at the moment of apparent victory when an American sharpshooter's bullet found its mark. Brock fell mortally wounded, his death sending shockwaves through the British ranks. Morrison witnessed the general's final moments, watching as the man who had become the symbol of Canadian resistance died defending the heights he had deemed essential to victory. As documented in the Niagara Spectator's coverage of the battle, Brock's death initially seemed to doom the Canadian cause. The American forces, encouraged by this success, pressed their advantage and succeeded in establishing a strong position on the heights. Van Rensselaer's plan appeared to be succeeding, with the vital strategic position falling into American hands. However, the loss of their beloved commander had the unexpected effect of strengthening Canadian resolve rather than breaking it. Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott, who had led the American assault, found himself in possession of a position he could not adequately defend. The narrow path that had allowed his men to reach the heights also limited his ability to bring up reinforcements and supplies. Morrison's militia, fighting now with the fury of men avenging their fallen leader, began to harass the American flanks. Young Samuel Hart distinguished himself by leading a small group of volunteers in a daring raid that captured vital intelligence about American dispositions. The boy's courage under fire had transformed him from a nervous youth into a seasoned warrior. Major General Roger Sheaffe, Brock's second-in-command, arrived with reinforcements and immediately began planning a coordinated assault to retake the heights. The British commander lacked Brock's charismatic leadership, but possessed solid tactical skills and the advantage of fresh troops. Morrison's company was assigned to support the main assault, their mission to prevent American reinforcements from crossing the river. The stage was set for a climactic battle that would determine whether Brock's sacrifice had been in vain or would inspire a victory that would secure the Canadian frontier for generations to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the blood-soaked heights of Queenston as Major General Sheaffe prepared his counterattack. Captain Morrison could see the American forces desperately trying to consolidate their position, but their precarious hold on the heights was becoming increasingly apparent. Lieutenant Colonel Scott's men were isolated, cut off from reinforcements by the treacherous river crossing and the deadly accuracy of Canadian marksmen positioned along the shore. Morrison's militia had been reinforced by companies from York and Hamilton, bringing their total strength to nearly 300 men. These were not the raw recruits who had faced Hull at Detroit. They were veterans now, hardened by months of warfare and united by their determination to avenge Brock's death. The general's sacrifice had transformed them from a collection of individual farmers and tradesmen into a cohesive fighting force. The tactical situation favored the defenders despite their temporary loss of the heights. American reinforcements attempting to cross the river faced devastating fire from Canadian artillery positioned on the flanks. Morrison watched through his spyglass as boat after boat was riddled with shot, their occupants either killed or forced to turn back. The narrow beach below the heights was becoming a killing ground that few Americans could survive. Sheaffe's plan was methodical and thorough, lacking Brock's dramatic flair but compensating with careful preparation and overwhelming force. Assault would begin with artillery bombardment to soften American positions, followed by a coordinated infantry attack from multiple directions. Morrison's militia would advance from the south while British regulars and indigenous warriors attacked from the north and west. Tecumseh's warriors had arrived from the Detroit frontier, their presence adding a psychological dimension to the coming battle. The Shawnee leader was determined to maintain the momentum gained at Detroit, and his men moved through the forest like hunting wolves, seeking any opportunity to strike at isolated American positions. Their war cries echoed across the heights, a sound that had haunted American nightmares since the war began. The bombardment commenced at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with Canadian guns methodically targeting American positions on the heights. Morrison could see the devastating effect of the artillery fire through his spyglass. American soldiers scrambling for cover behind improvised barricades while their officers attempted to maintain order. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage, as the trapped Americans realized the hopelessness of their situation. Young Samuel Hart had been promoted to sergeant after his heroic actions earlier in the battle, and Morrison assigned him to coordinate ammunition supplies for the advancing militia. The young man's transformation from frightened boy to seasoned warrior was complete. He moved with the confidence of a veteran, his earlier fears replaced by cold determination and tactical awareness. The infantry assault began with a coordinated advance from all directions, the various Canadian forces converging on the American positions like the closing of a trap. Morrison led his men up the southern slope, their advance covered by the continuing artillery bombardment. The Americans, caught between multiple attacking forces, began to waver as their tactical position became untenable. As reported in the Kingston Gazette's battlefield coverage, the American collapse was swift and decisive once it began. Lieutenant Colonel Scott, wounded and recognizing the impossibility of his situation, attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal to the river. However, the same narrow path that had allowed his men to reach the heights now became a death trap. As Canadian forces closed in from all sides, the final phase of the battle was a rout rather than a fight. American soldiers, trapped on the heights with no avenue of escape, began surrendering in large numbers. Morrison's militia found themselves accepting the surrender of men who had seemed invincible just hours before. The psychological impact of the defeat would resonate throughout the American military establishment. Thomas Mackenzie, the blacksmith-turned-warrior, captured an American artillery piece single-handedly, his powerful frame allowing him to overpower the gun crew before they could spike their cannon. His actions typified the individual heroism that characterized the Canadian militia throughout the campaign, ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances through courage and determination. The Battle of Queenston Heights had cost the Canadians their most inspirational leader, but it had also demonstrated their ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds through unity, tactical skill, and sheer determination. Morrison stood among the captured American equipment and prisoners, reflecting on how far his militia had come since those uncertain days at Fort George. They had evolved from a collection of farmers and tradesmen into a formidable military force, capable of defeating professional soldiers. The strategic implications of the victory were profound. The American invasion of the Niagara frontier had been decisively repelled, and the momentum that had begun with Hull's surrender at Detroit continued to build. Canadian morale soared while American confidence plummeted, setting the stage for the campaigns that would follow. The gray dawn of the 27th of April, 1813, brought with it the sight that Captain Morrison had long dreaded, a massive American fleet materializing out of the morning mist on Lake Ontario. 14 vessels carrying nearly 2,700 troops under Brigadier General Sabu Pike approached the provincial capital of York with deadly intent. Morrison's militia company had been hastily recalled from the Niagara frontier to help defend the seat of Upper Canada's government. The American strategy had evolved since their defeats at Detroit and Queenston Heights, rather than attempting another frontal assault across the Niagara River. They had chosen to strike at the heart of Canadian administration and military infrastructure. York, with its government buildings, military stores, and symbolic importance, represented a tempting target that could deliver both strategic and psychological victories. Morrison positioned his men along the shoreline west of the town, where Major General Sheaffe had established the primary defensive line. The Canadian forces were pitifully outnumbered, fewer than 700 regulars and militia against Pike's overwhelming invasion force. However, the defenders had learned valuable lessons from their previous encounters with American forces, and they were prepared to make the invaders pay dearly for every yard of Canadian soil. The American landing began at dawn, with Pike's forces establishing a beachhead despite fierce resistance from the defenders. Morrison watched his men fight with desperate courage, their muskets delivering deadly volleys into the ranks of blue-coated soldiers struggling ashore. Young Samuel Hart, now a seasoned veteran despite his youth, led a small group of volunteers in a daring raid that destroyed 2 American boats before they could disembark their troops. The defense of York was complicated by the presence of civilian residents who had remained in the town despite warnings to evacuate. Morrison found himself torn between his military duties and his responsibility to protect non-combatants who looked to the militia for protection. The American proclamations promising safety for civilians offered little comfort to people who remembered the harsh realities of frontier warfare. Pike's forces advanced methodically inland, their superior numbers gradually overwhelming the Canadian defensive positions. Morrison's militia conducted a fighting withdrawal, using their intimate knowledge of the local terrain to slow the American advance and inflict maximum casualties. Every building, every fence, every grove of trees became a potential fortress in the desperate battle for the capital. The turning point came when the retreating Canadians reached the government buildings and military installations that housed the colony's most important resources. Sheaffe, recognizing that the position was untenable, ordered the destruction of military supplies to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The explosion of the main ammunition depot created a thunderous blast that shook the entire town and sent debris raining down on both armies. Tragedy struck the American forces when General Pike himself was killed by falling debris from the explosion. Morrison witnessed the moment when the American commander was struck down, his death sending shockwaves through the invasion force. The loss of their leader at the moment of apparent victory demonstrated the unpredictable nature of warfare and the heavy price that both sides were paying for this conflict, as documented in the York Observer's coverage of the occupation. The American forces, enraged by Pike's death and frustrated by the fierce resistance they had encountered, began to exact revenge on the town itself. Government buildings were systematically burned, including the Legislative Assembly and the Lieutenant Governor's residence. The destruction went far beyond military necessity, representing a deliberate attempt to humiliate the Canadian population. Morrison's militia, though forced to retreat from the town, continued to harass the American forces from the surrounding countryside. They conducted night raids on American pickets, disrupted supply lines, and gathered intelligence about enemy movements. The young captain had learned that even in defeat, a determined militia could continue to resist and make life miserable for an occupying force. The American occupation of York lasted only 6 days, but the damage inflicted was both material and psychological. The burning of the government buildings was seen as a deliberate insult to British authority and Canadian identity. However, The destruction also had the unintended effect of strengthening Canadian resolve and providing justification for future retaliation against American targets. Thomas Mackenzie, the blacksmith, had been wounded during the fighting but refused to be evacuated. Instead, he established a hidden forge in the forest outside town, where he continued to repair weapons and manufacture ammunition for the continuing resistance. His determination exemplified the spirit of the Canadian militia. They might be defeated in battle, but they would never be conquered. The retreat from York marked a low point in the Canadian defense, but it also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the militia forces. They had learned to fight as guerrillas when conventional tactics failed, to preserve their strength for future battles, and to maintain morale even in the face of overwhelming odds. These lessons would prove invaluable in the campaigns that lay ahead. The frosted fields of Chrysler's farm stretched endlessly under the pale November sky of 1813, their stubble poking through the thin layer of snow like the bristles of some enormous brush. Captain Morrison, now Major Morrison, after his promotion following the defense of York, stood with his seasoned militia company as they prepared for what many believed would be the decisive battle of the war. The American forces under Major General James Wilkinson were advancing down the St. Lawrence River with over 8,000 troops, intent on capturing Montreal and ending British resistance in North America. Morrison's men had been integrated into Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Morrison's Corps of British Regulars and Canadian Militia, a force of fewer than 900 soldiers tasked with stopping an army nearly 10 times their size. The tactical situation seemed hopeless, yet these veterans had learned that numbers alone did not determine victory. They had seen Hull surrender at Detroit, defeated Scott at Queenston Heights, and survived the burning of York. Now they would make their stand in the muddy fields of a small farm along the St. Lawrence. The American strategy was sound in principle, a massive force advancing on Montreal while a second army approached from the south through the Champlain Valley. If successful, this pincer movement would capture the key to British power in North America and effectively end the war. Wilkinson's army was the largest American force yet assembled in the Northern Theater, equipped with artillery, cavalry, and all the logistical support necessary for a major campaign. Morrison's militia had been positioned on the British left flank, where their knowledge of local terrain and proven ability to fight in broken country would be most valuable. The major looked down the line at faces he had come to know as well as his own family. Samuel Hart, now a lieutenant commanding his own section. Thomas Mackenzie, recovered from his wounds and carrying a captured American musket. Dozens of other farmers and tradesmen who had become warriors through necessity and courage. The battle began at mid-morning on the 11th of November, with American forces advancing in column toward the British positions. Morrison could see the confidence in their movement. They outnumbered the defenders so dramatically that victory seemed inevitable. However, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had chosen his ground carefully, positioning his forces where the Americans would be forced to attack across open fields while the defenders enjoyed cover and concealment. The first American assault was repelled, with devastating losses as Canadian musketry and artillery tore gaps in the advancing columns. Morrison's militia, fighting from behind a rail fence, delivered volley after volley into the blue-coated ranks. The Americans, expecting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers, found themselves facing opponents who had learned to maximize their firepower through disciplined tactics and superior positioning. Young Lieutenant Hart had matured into a skilled tactical leader, his section of militia moving with the precision of regular troops. The boy who had once trembled at the sound of distant gunfire now calmly directed his men's fire, conserving ammunition while maximizing casualties among the advancing enemy. His transformation symbolized the evolution of the entire Canadian militia from amateur soldiers to hardened veterans. The critical moment came when American forces attempted to outflank the British position by advancing through a wooded area. On the left, Morrison's militia, familiar with forest fighting from their experiences with Tecumseh's warriors, met this threat with a combination of conventional tactics and guerrilla warfare. They fell back slowly through the trees, making the Americans pay for every yard while maintaining their cohesion and firepower, as documented in the Montreal Herald's coverage of the battle. The American attack began to falter as casualties mounted, and confusion spread through their ranks. Wilkinson's forces, accustomed to overwhelming weaker opponents through numerical superiority, found themselves engaged in a grinding battle of attrition against enemies who refused to break. The psychological impact of facing such determined resistance began to undermine American morale. The decisive moment came when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison ordered a counterattack that caught the Americans while they were reorganizing for another assault. The British regulars advanced with fixed bayonets while Morrison's militia provided covering fire, their combined assault breaking the American line and forcing a general retreat. The sight of their enemy fleeing across the fields they had seemed certain to capture was a moment of pure triumph for the Canadian defenders. Thomas Mackenzie distinguished himself during the final phase of the battle by leading a small group of volunteers in pursuit of the retreating Americans. The former blacksmith had become a skilled warrior, his practical intelligence and physical strength making him a natural leader. His actions typified the individual heroism that had characterized the Canadian militia throughout the war. The Battle of Chrysler's Farm effectively ended the American invasion of the St. Lawrence Valley and demonstrated that Canadian militia, when properly led and positioned, could defeat even the largest American armies. Morrison stood among the captured equipment and prisoners, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him and his men from the uncertain days of 1812 to this moment of decisive victory. The war would continue for several more months, but the strategic initiative had shifted decisively in favor of the defenders. The Canadian militia had proven that their homeland could not be conquered by force, that ordinary citizens could become extraordinary soldiers when defending their families and communities. Major Morrison and his men had played a crucial role in forging a national identity that would endure long after the last shot was fired. The legacy of the War of 1812 would be found not in the grand strategies of generals or the movements of armies, but in the courage of individual soldiers who chose to stand and fight when their homeland was threatened. The Canadian militia had written their names in history with blood and sacrifice, ensuring that their descendants would inherit a free and independent nation.